The melody drifting from our living room every Tuesday evening should have been beautiful, but something about those piano lessons felt wrong from the very beginning. I trusted Elena Morrison with my daughter's musical education for 6 months before discovering that her fingers had wandered far beyond the piano keys. What started as classical training became the most orchestrated deception I'd ever encountered. And the professional complaint that followed didn't just end her teaching career. It exposed a pattern of predatory behavior that had destroyed families across 3 different states. It began last September when 13-year-old Chloe announced she wanted to learn piano. She'd been inspired by a performance at her school's cultural fair, where a visiting pianist had played Chopin with such passion that half the audience was in tears. "Mom, I want to make people feel things like that," she told me, her eyes still bright with wonder. My husband David was thrilled. He'd always regretted not learning an instrument as a child. Within a week, he'd found Elena Morrison through the community bulletin board at our local coffee shop. Her advertisement was elegant and professional, printed on cream-colored cardstock with gold lettering. Elena Morrison, concert pianist and private instructor, Juilliard graduate, specializing in classical technique and performance preparation. House calls available for serious students. "She's a Juilliard graduate," David told me excitedly. "And she makes house calls, which is perfect since our schedule is so crazy. Plus, she charges reasonable rates for someone with her credentials." When I called Elena to discuss lessons, her voice was warm and cultured with just a hint of an accent that suggested European training. "I'd love to meet Chloe and assess her natural abilities," she said. "Some children have an intuitive understanding of music that can be developed quite remarkably with proper guidance." Our new instructor arrived for Chloe's first lesson on a crisp autumn evening, carrying a leather music bag and wearing a flowing emerald dress that seemed too formal for a suburban piano lesson. She was perhaps 35, with dark hair swept into a sophisticated chignon and the kind of classical beauty that belonged on album covers rather than in our modest living room. "You have a lovely home," she said, her voice carrying that intriguing accent. "And what a magnificent piano. A 1985 Yamaha Baby Grand. These instruments have such warmth and character." Elena approached our piano with obvious reverence, settling onto the bench with perfect posture. When she began to play the opening notes of Debussy's Clair de Lune, the difference between her touch and our previous attempts was immediately obvious. The music filled our living room, transforming the familiar space into something that felt almost sacred. "This is what we're working toward," she said softly when the piece concluded. "Not just technical proficiency, but the ability to communicate emotion through music. True artistry requires connecting with something deeper." Chloe was immediately enchanted. During that first lesson, I watched from the kitchen as Elena guided my daughter through basic exercises, her teaching style patient but precise. She corrected Chloe's posture gently and explained theory with metaphors that made complex concepts accessible. "Think of your fingers as raindrops," I heard her say. "Each note should feel effortless, like water falling naturally from the sky." The lessons became a weekly ritual that quickly established itself as the highlight of our Tuesday evenings. Elena would arrive promptly at 7 o'clock, transforming our living room with her presence alone. Chloe progressed rapidly under her instruction, moving from simple scales to Bach inventions within just 2 months. "She's remarkably skilled," David would say after Elena left each week. "You can tell she's had world-class training. Chloe is so lucky to have an instructor of that caliber." I agreed wholeheartedly. Our piano teacher was undeniably gifted, and Chloe was improving dramatically. But something about the lessons bothered me in ways I couldn't articulate. Maybe it was how Elena would linger in our entryway, after lessons chatting about topics that seemed peripheral to music education. Or how she'd ask detailed questions about David's work at the accounting firm, where he specialized in tax preparation. "Your husband has such interesting perspectives on financial planning," she mentioned to me one evening. We had a fascinating discussion about investment strategies for creative professionals last week. When had they discussed investment strategies? The lessons were only an hour long, and Elena typically left immediately afterward. But David had never mentioned having extended conversations with her about anything other than Chloe's progress. She's incredibly well-rounded for someone who spent years focused exclusively on performance, David commented when I mentioned Elena's interest in his expertise. It makes sense that she'd want to pick the brain of someone who understands tax preparation and business finances. The first real warning sign came in December when I arrived home from grocery shopping to find David and Elena sitting together on our living room couch, sharing a glass of wine. They were leaning toward each other in animated conversation, their body language suggesting intimacy rather than casual acquaintance. Chloe was nowhere to be seen. "Where's Chloe?" I asked, setting down my shopping bags with more force than necessary. "Piano lesson ended early tonight," David explained quickly. "She developed a headache, so she went upstairs to rest. Elena and I were just discussing her progress and some additional pieces she might tackle next semester." Elena smiled warmly. "Your daughter has such natural musical intuition. I was telling David that with proper nurturing, she could potentially pursue music professionally." She stood gracefully gathering her things. "Thank you for the wine, David. It was exactly what I needed after such a long day." After she left, I confronted David about the wine. "Since when do we serve alcohol to Chloe's piano teacher? And why was she still here if the lesson ended early?" "She mentioned having a particularly stressful day," he said defensively. "I was just being hospitable. You always say we should treat service providers with respect and kindness, but something about the scene I'd walked into felt more social than professional, more intimate than appropriate. January brought more unsettling incidents. Elena began arriving early for lessons, sometimes by 15 or 20 minutes. "I like to prepare mentally before teaching," she explained. "It helps me focus on what each student needs, but instead of preparing, she'd chat with David about everything from current events to his marathon training. I'd overhear their conversations from the kitchen, noting how easily they'd moved from discussing Chloe's progress to sharing personal anecdotes about topics completely unrelated to music education. I also noticed changes in David's behavior. He started working out more frequently, claiming his doctor had recommended additional exercise. His wardrobe gradually shifted toward more stylish clothing, new sweaters, better-fitting jeans, cologne that appeared without explanation. "I'm trying to take better care of myself," he said when I commented on his improved grooming habits. I realized I'd gotten lazy about my appearance. The most disturbing change was in our Tuesday evening routine. Previously, David and I would spend those evenings together after Chloe's lesson. Now he'd disappear into his home office immediately after Elena left, claiming he had urgent tax work that couldn't wait. The breakthrough came in February, purely by accident. I had picked up David's phone instead of mine from the kitchen counter. They were nearly identical black smartphones, and saw a text notification from E. Morrison. Something about seeing Elena's name on his phone screen at 9 o'clock on a Saturday evening made me pause. Curiosity overrode my usual respect for privacy, and I opened the message thread. What I found made my hands shake. The conversation was extensive, dating back months. What had started as brief discussions about Chloe's progress had evolved into something entirely different. There were compliments about David's intelligence and sense of humor, shared inside jokes, and increasingly personal revelations about their lives and feelings. Elena had shared intimate details about her divorce 2 years ago, describing the emotional devastation and challenges of rebuilding her life. David had responded with confessions about feeling unappreciated at work and disconnected from family life. She told David how she'd once fallen in love with her piano professor in Vienna, a married man who promised to leave his wife but never did. The scandal that followed ruined her early career, branded her a temptress in conservatory circles, and left her with a deep mistrust of both men and marriage. "They always go back to their wives," she'd written, "unless you show them something they're willing to lose everything for." David had replied, "You've shown me exactly that." The most recent exchange made my stomach drop. "Elena, I can't stop thinking about our conversation last night. You understand me in ways I never expected to find again." David, I feel the same way. These Tuesday evenings have become the highlight of my week, and not just because of Chloe's progress. Elena. We need to be careful. This situation is complicated for both of us. David. I know we need to be discreet, but I can't pretend these feelings don't exist. You've awakened something in me that I thought was gone forever. I scrolled through months of messages, each revealing deeper layers of emotional infidelity. They had been meeting outside of piano lessons, coffee dates disguised as discussions about Chloe's progress, evening walks supposedly to continue conversations about music theory. I'd spent the whole weekend reading their messages. At first, I'd only felt rage. But somewhere between the jokes and midnight confessions, I started to see something else, a woman desperately trying to be seen. Again and again, Elena hinted at a past betrayal that had broken her compass. Still, understanding didn't mean forgiving. She may have been wounded, but she'd chosen to bleed inside my house. Elena had confided her struggles with loneliness and financial security as a freelance instructor. David had shared his own vulnerabilities, midlife concerns about relevance frustration with suburban predictability, questions about whether he'd settled for security instead of following his passions. But the most damaging revelation came in messages from just 3 days ago. David. I can't keep pretending everything is normal at home. Sarah deserves to know the truth about how I'm feeling. Elena, are you sure you're ready for that conversation? Once we're honest about our connection, everything changes. David. I'm tired of living a lie. You've shown me what it feels like to be truly understood. I screenshot every message documenting months of emotional betrayal. Then I quietly returned David's phone and went upstairs to think. The woman I'd been 6 months ago would have confronted David immediately with tears and accusations. But sitting in my bedroom with evidence of his affair, I felt something colder settling over me. Elena wasn't just having an emotional affair with my husband. She was conducting it under my roof, using my daughter's piano lessons as cover, exploiting our family's trust. I spent the weekend researching Elena's background. Her credentials were legitimate. She had indeed graduated from Juilliard and performed professionally. But I also discovered troubling patterns. She'd left her previous city abruptly after what appeared to be a scandal involving inappropriate relationships with clients. Online searches revealed forum discussions from 2 years ago that mentioned her name in connection with unprofessional conduct and inappropriate relationships with adult family members. One comment stood out. She was an excellent teacher technically, but several families reported that she became inappropriately involved in personal matters. There were rumors about her pursuing relationships with married fathers, using children's lessons as opportunities to access their homes. The pattern was clear. This wasn't Elena's first time using music lessons to access married men. She was a predator who specifically targeted families where she could establish intimate access and develop trust with vulnerable parents. Tuesday arrived with crystalline clarity about what needed to happen. I prepared for the evening as usual, but I also set up a small recording device in the living room, hidden behind some books on the piano. If Elena and David were going to continue their affair in my home, I wanted documentation. Our instructor arrived at her usual time, greeting David with a hug that lasted slightly too long. "How was your day?" she asked him, completely ignoring my presence. "Better now," he replied, his voice carrying obvious intimacy. The lesson proceeded normally for 30 minutes. Elena worked with Chloe on a challenging Chopin piece demonstrating technique and explaining emotional context. She was genuinely skilled, and Chloe's improvement was dramatic. But when Chloe took a break to get water, I watched Elena and David's body language shift completely. They leaned closer together, their conversation dropping to whispers. Elena placed her hand on David's arm, and he covered it with his own in a gesture of obvious intimacy. "Chloe," I called from the kitchen, "why don't you start your science homework? I think that's enough piano for tonight." "But Mom, we still have 20 minutes left," Chloe protested. "Elena looks tired tonight. We can make up the time next week." As Chloe reluctantly headed upstairs, I returned to the living room, where Elena and David were still sitting close together. "Actually, Elena, could I speak with you privately? I have some questions about Chloe's progress." David started to stand. I should probably— No, I said firmly. Stay. This involves you too. I pulled out my phone and opened the screenshot album I'd prepared. I accidentally picked up David's phone yesterday evening and saw your text conversation. All of it. Going back months. The color drained from both of their faces. Elena's composure cracked completely, her elegant facade replaced by panic. David's mouth opened without producing sound. Sarah, I can explain, Elena began. Can you— Because what I see is months of deception and professional misconduct. You've been conducting an emotional affair with my husband while teaching my daughter using our family's trust to access and seduce a married man. David found his voice. Sarah, it's not what you think. It's exactly what I think. You've been having an emotional affair for months, sharing intimate details, meeting secretly, planning some kind of future together. What I want to know is whether this is Elena's first time seducing a married client, or if there's a history here. Elena stood abruptly, her facade completely gone. I don't have to listen to these accusations. Yes, you do. Because I've done my research, Elena. The forum discussions about your previous teaching position, the unprofessional conduct that made you leave Philadelphia so suddenly. The families who reported inappropriate relationships with married fathers. This isn't your first time targeting families through music lessons, is it? She stared at me with shock. You investigated me. I protected my family, just like I'm going to continue protecting them. I turned to David. Pack a bag. You can stay at your brother's place until we figure out what comes next. Sarah, please, let me explain. There's nothing to explain. You chose to have an emotional affair with our daughter's piano teacher. In our home. While she was upstairs practicing. You used our family's trust to facilitate a relationship that crossed every line of appropriate conduct. Elena grabbed her music bag, hands shaking. I never meant for this to happen. Yes, you did. You've done this before, probably multiple times. You target families with teenage children, establish yourself as a trusted professional, then exploit access to pursue married men. You're a predator who uses music education as cover for relationship manipulation. Elena's composure shattered completely. You don't understand the situation. David and I connected on a level that transcends— Stop. You're a music teacher who seduced a married client while teaching his child. That's the reality. You violated professional ethics, exploited our family's trust, and potentially broke laws regarding client relationships. What laws? David asked weakly. Professional service providers have legal obligations regarding appropriate conduct with clients' families. Your teaching certification includes specific clauses about maintaining professional boundaries. Your professional association definitely has ethics guidelines that you've violated. I looked directly at Elena. I'm filing complaints with your professional association and any other relevant oversight bodies. Other families deserve to know about your history of predatory behavior. Elena went white. You can't destroy my career over this. Teaching is all I have. You should have considered that before you chose to seduce married clients. Actions have consequences, Elena. You've violated professional ethics, manipulated families, and potentially broken laws. David stood slowly. I'll pack a bag. But Sarah, we need to talk about this. I am calm, calmer than I've been in months. For the first time since you started this affair, I understand exactly what's happening and what needs to happen next. After they both left, Elena fleeing like a criminal, David reluctantly packing while muttering apologies, I sat in the sudden quiet of my living room. The piano sat silent, no longer the centerpiece of elegant lessons, but a reminder of how professional relationships could be weaponized against trusting families. The most important realization was how different I felt from the woman who had welcomed Elena into our home 6 months earlier. That woman had been trusting, willing to assume the best about people. The woman sitting in my living room now understood that trust had to be earned through consistent, appropriate conduct. Chloe appeared at the top of the stairs. Mom, is everything okay? Where did Elena and Dad go? I looked up at my 13-year-old daughter, her face full of confusion, and realized the hardest part was just beginning. Come sit with me, sweetheart. We need to talk about some changes that are going to happen in our family. Over the next hour, I explained that Elena would no longer be her piano teacher due to professional misconduct issues, and that her father would be staying elsewhere while we worked through marriage problems. Was Elena a bad person? Chloe asked. Elena is a skilled musician who made very poor personal choices that hurt our family. Sometimes, people can be good at their jobs while still doing wrong things. That doesn't make them entirely bad, but it does mean there have to be consequences. Is it my fault? Absolutely not, sweetheart. This situation is entirely about adult choices that had nothing to do with your music. Both your father and Elena made inappropriate decisions, and now there have to be changes to protect our family. 3 months later, I was sitting in a family court mediator's office finalizing divorce terms. The process had been more amicable than expected, partly because David's guilt made him agreeable to generous arrangements, and partly because the evidence made denial impossible. Elena had left town within 2 weeks, apparently moving to another state to restart her career. But her departure hadn't protected her from professional consequences. The complaint I'd filed with the Music Teachers National Association triggered a formal investigation. Several other families came forward with similar stories about inappropriate conduct during lessons. Not necessarily affairs, but misconduct that made parents uncomfortable. Elena's professional certification was revoked, effectively ending her career as a private instructor. The investigation revealed she'd been operating without proper licenses in 2 previous states, suggesting a consistent history of avoiding oversight while targeting families. I'm glad you pushed for a thorough investigation, said Patricia Williams, the MTNA representative. We discovered she'd been reported in at least 3 different states for similar behavior. Each time, families chose to handle situations privately, rather than filing formal complaints, which allowed her to simply move and find new victims. How many families do you think she affected? Based on what we found, probably at least a dozen over 5 years. Some involved emotional affairs with married fathers, others were misconduct that made families uncomfortable. The approach was consistent. Establish trust through excellent teaching, then gradually cross professional boundaries. The most satisfying outcome wasn't the financial settlement. It was knowing that Elena would never again exploit children's music lessons to access and manipulate families. Chloe continued with piano lessons under Mrs. Patterson, a 70-year-old grandmother who taught from her own home and maintained crystal-clear boundaries. Chloe's playing continued improving, though she occasionally missed Elena's dramatic teaching style. I'm sorry Elena turned out to be a bad person, Chloe said one evening. She wasn't entirely bad, I replied honestly. She was genuinely talented and helped you develop beautiful skills, but she made very poor personal choices that hurt people, and those choices had consequences. Like Dad. Your father isn't a bad person either, but he made choices that damaged our marriage. Now he's learning to take responsibility and figure out how to be better. David had been attending counseling and was working to rebuild Chloe's trust. He saw her regularly and seemed committed to personal growth rather than just managing consequences. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I received a phone call from Detective Lisa Rodriguez with the Portland Police Department. Mrs. Harrison, I'm calling because your name came up in connection with an investigation regarding Elena Morrison. What kind of investigation? Financial fraud and identity theft. Ms. Morrison has been arrested for stealing personal information from client families and using it to open credit accounts. Your complaint helped us establish a history of predatory behavior that supported our criminal case. Financial fraud, I never noticed unusual activity on our accounts. You were lucky. Several families weren't as fortunate. She apparently used her extended time in client homes during lessons to access personal documents when families weren't watching closely. Mail financial statements, anything she could photograph quickly with her phone. The revelation was shocking, but not entirely surprising. Someone willing to exploit professional relationships for emotional manipulation would likely have few qualms about financial exploitation. We're investigating potential violations of state laws regarding professional misconduct with clients. If we can prove a pattern across state lines, federal charges might be appropriate, I provided Detective Rodriguez with all my documentation, including screenshots of David and Elena's conversations, records of her early arrivals and extended visits, and the background investigation I'd conducted. "This is incredibly thorough," Detective Rodriguez said. "Most families don't document this behavior so systematically. Your evidence could be crucial for establishing her methods across multiple jurisdictions." 3 months later, Detective Rodriguez called with an update. Elena Morrison pled guilty to charges of identity theft, fraud, and professional misconduct. She's been sentenced to 18 months in prison and ordered to pay restitution to victimized families. Will she be able to continue teaching after release? No. Her conviction prevents her from obtaining professional certifications in any state. She's also been placed on a national registry of individuals prohibited from working with children or accessing client homes. This outcome meant she could never again use music education as cover for exploiting families. The predatory behavior that had affected dozens of families over many years had finally been broken. How many families were ultimately affected? 14 families across 4 states suffered financial losses. But based on complaints that came forward after her arrest, we believe she had inappropriate relationships with married clients in at least 8 additional cases. Your decision to file formal complaints probably prevented her from victimizing many more families. That evening, I shared the news with Chloe, now 14 and thriving under Mrs. Patterson's guidance. Elena was arrested for stealing money from families she taught. Really, she was stealing from people. She was using her access to homes during lessons to gather personal information for identity theft. Some families lost thousands of dollars. Chloe was quiet, processing this information. "I'm glad you caught her when you did. What if she had stolen from us too? That's exactly why it's important to trust your instincts when something feels wrong, and to take action when you have evidence of inappropriate behavior. Sometimes, protecting your own family means protecting other families too." As I reflected on how completely our lives had transformed, I realized the woman who had welcomed Elena into our home was gone, replaced by someone who understood that the most dangerous threats often came disguised as helpful professionals. The piano lessons had ended, but the education had been invaluable. I'd learned to trust my instincts, investigate concerns, and take decisive action when evidence confirmed inappropriate conduct. Most importantly, I'd learned that protecting your family sometimes requires destroying relationships that threaten your family's safety. Elena had been an excellent piano teacher, but she'd also been a predator. David had been a loving husband for 12 years, but he'd also been willing to betray our marriage. Both relationships had to end for our family to heal and move forward safely. The melody that now filled our home came from Chloe's own compositions, created through honest artistic expression, rather than manipulative performance. It was far more beautiful than anything our former instructor had ever produced, because it was built on authentic talent and love rather than calculated deception.